objection then and now. And I thought I could give you a lot of statistics and facts and dates, but those are easy to find if you want them. So I thought I'd start off, given that the title of Conscience's series is Voices of Conscientious Objection, I thought I'd start off with some personal stories. So I want to tell you about three quite different, but also quite similar, conscientious objectors. So the person in the top left of the pictures, sorry, the picture's rather grainy. It was taken in 1916. And that is Howard Martin, who at this stage, he was 31. He was a bank clerk in near Watford, just north of London. And he was a Quaker and of course, therefore, a pacifist. And as many of you will know, after World War I started in 1914, although there was a lot of pressure to join the armed forces, conscription as such wasn't introduced until the beginning of 1916. And as Karen mentioned earlier, there was technically the right to conscientious objection in law, but in practice, most people who applied for exemption from fighting were not given exemption, and especially if you refused to be involved in any sort of anything that would help the war effort at all, which you would if you believed the war itself to be an immoral activity. And like Howard Martin, you would find yourself forced into the army. So how it typically worked is the tribunal would say, no, you are a soldier, off you go into the army. You wouldn't regard yourself as a soldier. You'd be taken to the barracks or the parade ground or wherever, where you might refuse to put on uniform. You might agree to put on uniform. Different people reacted differently. You might refuse orders altogether, as many people did, refuse any orders. Then there was other people who would accept orders if it was something like peeling potatoes, because they didn't object to people eating, but they wouldn't obey orders to, pick up a gun or load guns into a truck or something. Everybody had to make their own decisions, often under a lot of pressure at very, very short notice. And Howard started by trying to obey what he thought were reasonable orders, such as distributing food, but in the end realized that drawing the line was very, very difficult, and he ended up basically refusing to be part of the system at all. And what would happen is that you'd be accused of disobeying orders because you were technically a soldier, in the eyes of the law, if not in your own eyes. And then you'd be given 14 days in detention, 28 days in detention, whatever it might be. You'd be released, you'd be given another order, you'd refuse that, another 14 days in detention, and so on and so on. Unbearably, unimaginably stressful, in some ways much harder than it became later in the war, when COs were more often just given 2 years in prison and went to a civilian prison. Howard found himself amongst one of 35 prisoners who were especially badly treated. Because if you disobeyed an order while you were at the barracks in Britain, while you were at the military base in Britain, the maximum penalty was imprisonment. But if you disobeyed an order while you were at the front in France or Belgium, the maximum penalty was death. And the army, in an attempt to break conscientious objectors, shipped 35 objectors who were technically soldiers out to the front in France to tell them that they were soldiers and they had to fight, and if they refused orders, they would be shot. And these 35 conscientious objectors, COs as we say for short, these 35 COs, all of them, every one of them, refused to obey orders. They were all ready to go the whole way, unimaginably. The oldest amongst them was 34, the youngest was 19. And they, this odd collection of Christian socialists and Marxists and Jehovah's Witnesses and anarchists, all of them refused. And they were all sentenced to death. Howard was the first to be sentenced to death. But at the last moment, because of lobbying back in Britain, the sentence was commuted to 10 years imprisonment. So Howard Martin, perhaps a common image we might have of a conscientious objector. But the other two pictures you can see here, these are people who you can tell have been around much more recently. So the person on the right, the woman on the right, that is Thayas Kamina. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She is an Israeli, and like all Israeli men and women, she faced conscription at the age of 18. There are a few exemptions I won't go into now, but mostly you're generally expected to join the armed forces at the age of 18 in Israel. And it's one of the few countries that conscripts women as well as men, although the number the number of countries that do that is increasing. And Thayas went through an experience in some ways not dissimilar to Howard Martin all those years ago. She refused to join, was given so many days in prison, refused again, so many days in prison again, and so on and so on. After a while, she'd been a total of 150 days in prison, but that was in 6 or 7 short sentences, which in some ways, I don't know, I find it hard to imagine. I suspect it might be more stressful than just having it all in one go and knowing where you are. What tends to happen in Israel is that after a few of these sentences, the army will sometimes give up. And they decided that Thayas could be released from the army on ground, or should be released from the army on grounds of bad behavior, which is ironic, really, as War Resisters International said at the time, if there was more bad behavior like this, the world would be a better place. But of course, it's meant to be a deterrent to other people. Thayas was eventually released in 2016. And the third person here in the naval uniform, that's Michael Lyons, and he's British, and he's a very recent conscientious objector. If you haven't heard of Mike Lyons, you might be wondering how somebody could be a CO in Britain so recently, given that we haven't had conscription in Britain since, as Karen mentioned, since the early 1960s. And yet, if you voluntarily join the armed forces, you obviously find yourself going through all sorts of experiences that would be unimaginable to most of us. And many people find their feelings, their views, their perspectives changing. And in theory, if you develop a conscientious objection to war while you're in the British Armed Forces, you have a right to apply to be discharged. It's very much in theory. It very rarely happens in practice. Oddly, when it does happen, it's usually the RAF, but I won't go into that now. Mike Lyons, at the age of 24, I think he was, having been in the Navy a few years, found that he could no longer conscientiously support the war in Afghanistan. And in 2010, he applied for exemption and for discharge as a conscientious objector. He went through all the procedures properly. He went through all the regulations properly. He went through every stage. His commanding officer said he was naive and wrong, but thought he was genuine and said he should be discharged. His chaplain, his Christian chaplain, said he should not be discharged, which to me as a Christian makes me particularly angry. And at every level he was turned down, and eventually he went to the final level, the Advisory Committee on Conscientious Objection, which is a civil service body you can appeal to, but is appealed to so rarely that it hadn't actually met for 12 years. There was a civil servant who was technically clerk to the Advisory Committee on Conscientious Objection. I hope he'd had some other work for the previous 12 years because, he hadn't met. Mike went there and was turned down. And it was quite obvious by this point that given he was getting publicity, the Navy did not want to discharge him for fear that other members of the armed forces would learn of their right to conscientious objection and would apply for discharge. Mike was then ordered to pick up a rifle and participate in target practice, and he refused. And he was arrested and charged with disobeying a legal order. Disobeying a legal order. I sat in the public gallery through part of Mike's court-martial in Portsmouth in 2011. It was a mockery of justice. It was a foregone conclusion. And Mike was sentenced to 7 months in military prison. So if anyone asks when the most recent time that a British conscientious objector went to prison for refusing to fight, it was within the last 10 years.